mentioned that studying organizational behavior, we are going to go through 3 phases. We are going to study first individual behavior, organization behavior on individual level. Then we are going to study organization behavior on group level. And finally, we are going to study organization behavior on organizational level. Okay. Today we'll start with the first level, okay, which is related to individuals' behavior. Now, in this chapter, which is Foundations of Individual Behavior, we are going to go through some topics which is related to individuals' behavior within organizations, okay, such as ability, learning, and so on. Okay, the learning objectives for this chapter are: we need to know what are the different types of ability, and we need to know what are the differences between those types of ability. Of course, we are going to talk about intellectual ability and physical abilities. We are going to, or we need to discuss what is the definition of each, what are the types of each ability. Also, one of the topics that we are going to discuss is biographical characteristics of individuals and how this should affect the behavior of employees within the organization. More learning objectives are related to learning. Okay, one of the dynamics or mechanisms which is influencing individuals' behavior within an organization is learning and how people learn. In this regard, we need to discuss different theories which is related to learning in addition to other things. Okay. Also, we need to know about how we can shape behavior. Okay. There are some theories which is related to learning, like reinforcement theory and so on. Those theories should help us in understanding how people, how management can shape behavior of employees within the organization. All those are topics which we are going to discuss through this chapter. First, let us start with ability. Okay, what is ability? Yes. Okay, here we are talking about capacities individuals have, which should help them in performing different tasks related to the job. Okay, so each job there are tasks which are required to be performed by employees occupying this job. Okay, those tasks in order to be performed, people need abilities. Okay, or they should have capacity to perform those tasks. When we talk about ability, we say that there are 2 main types of ability. Okay, we say that there is the intellectual ability and the physical ability. What is the difference between intellectual ability and physical ability? Yes?
Intellectual abilities are related to the abilities concerning with thinking, solving problems, and using minds. Physical abilities related to body works, body activities.
Okay. So there are some tasks which need intellectual abilities, like, for example, reasoning, thinking, etc. In addition to that, there are other tasks which need physical efforts in order to be performed. Okay. In this regard, we say that there are intellectual abilities and there are physical abilities. Now, when we talk about intellectual abilities, okay, here we mean the we mean here the capacity to perform activities which require mental abilities. Okay. An example for those such as thinking, reasoning, problem solving. When we talk about thinking, we are talking here about abstract thinking and so on. Okay. All those are abilities which we call intellectual abilities. Okay. But of course we are going to talk about the dimensions of intellectual abilities. Those are examples for intellectual abilities. Now when you talk about the dimensions, there are different dimensions of intellectual abilities. One of those is number aptitude. Okay, number aptitude is the ability to deal with numbers. Here we are talking about mathematical abilities for example, this requires number aptitude. Okay, the ability to deal with numbers in general, like if we are talking about an accountant, for example, or someone who is specialized in statistics, for example, those people, they need number aptitude. This ability should help them to perform tasks related to their jobs. Okay, verbal comprehension. What is verbal comprehension? Yes.
It is the ability to understand and analyze different statements or different tasks concerning our understanding.
Okay, and this ability we need for what? What for we need this ability? Yes?
Relation between words and then to understand it.
To communicate with others and interact with others. So not all intellectual abilities are related to, for example, numbers, visualizing, and so on. There are some abilities which is related to how can we deal with other people, like, for example, verbal comprehension. Okay, perceptual speed. Here we are talking about perception and up to what extent people can catch up with ideas, analyze those ideas, understand the ideas, the concepts, and so on. Okay, inductive reasoning. Okay, when you talk about inductive reasoning, here we are talking about up to what extent people can understand the logical sequence of a situation or problem. Okay, when we talk about logical sequence, we are talking here about the steps, procedures, which things should happen first, which second, which third, in order to reach a solution for a certain situation. This we call inductive reasoning. Now, another type is deductive reasoning. Okay, when you talk about deductive reasoning, here we are talking about the ability to understand the implications of a certain situation. If we have done something, okay, what are the consequences here? What are the implications? What should happen? Okay, this we call deductive reasoning. Okay, spatial visualization. Anyone have idea what is spatial visualization? Yes?
It means about how people can, the people's imagination of how they could connect the things together in a space or something like that.
Okay. People who are working in design, for example, decorative design, even if we are talking about websites design, anything, architects, okay, yes. All those people need to imagine what is the future picture of something, how it is going to look, and so on. This we call spatial visualization. Okay, it is the ability to imagine the future shape or of something. Okay, whether we are talking here, if we are talking about an architect, here we are talking about the how the building is going to look at that. Okay, if we are talking about decorative engineer, okay, here we are talking about, for example, or interior decorative specialist, and so on. Here we are talking about how the furniture is going to look at the end, and the design, interior design, and so on. Okay, so here we are talking about the ability of individuals to imagine or visualize the future status of something they are working or dealing with. Memory, of course, we are talking about the ability to memorize data and so on. Okay, now those abilities, of course, it is not all the intellectual abilities. Those are only examples, okay, of intellectual abilities. Again, we said that intellectual ability is important to deal with tasks which needs mental abilities, or we are talking here about mental activities or those tasks which require mental capacity. Okay, how this should influence or affect the behavior of employees within the organization. How intellectual abilities, okay, for example, should influence or affect the behavior of individuals within the organization. Yes?
There used to have a high percentage of these dimensions of intellectuality that will affect their work or activities or tasks in their organization,
Okay.
which might raise the effectiveness.
What else? Yes?
This might help them to have the accurate thinking and the accurate decision
this is another side of the issue. What else? Yes?
I think whenever we're talking about people with intellectual abilities, we are saying that these people are smart and always able to move on to higher levels within their work, only because they can understand the problem or they can make a very good information analysis, and this will affect their behavior, because intellectual people are always confident and they are always reliable most of the time, and they always seek for more. So they are never satisfied by certain things. They always seek for more and they expect more from the organization.
Okay, but before continuing with the question and the answers related to the question, when you talk about intellectual abilities, we are not talking about here a standard. Intellectual abilities, it is, and there is a relative relation between intellectual abilities and the requirements of the job. Not all jobs required high intellectual abilities, but there are some intellectual abilities which are important to perform a certain tasks. Okay, but when you talk about intelligence, okay, there is no standards to measure intelligence in general. This can be done only for children. Like IQ, we are talking here about measuring the intelligence of people under 12 years old or 11 years old, something like that, okay? But when you talk about people who are, or when we talk about professional people working, performing jobs within organizations and different kind and types of jobs, here we are not talking about a standard intelligence capacity that all employees should have. Here we are talking about something which is different from one job to another job. Okay, so for example, for certain jobs there is a certain intellectual abilities and certain intelligence level needed, and for other jobs there are other abilities and there is another level which is needed to perform, I mean here intelligence level needed to perform. Okay, so again here it's not a matter that people are intelligent or not, no. Here we are talking about some sort of relative relation between intelligence level and the job itself. Again, one of the issues that were proposed that people or intellectual abilities, sorry, it should help employees to take the right decisions, and this is correct. Okay, this is one of the issues that we need in order to understand the relation between abilities and the behavior of employees. Okay, but in general, here we are talking about performance. This is an important issue which is related to decision making and so on. But let us talk in general, not in detail. Okay, now, when you talk about intellectual abilities, it should help people to decide what they can do and what they cannot do. Okay, and this is important also when we talk about other abilities. Okay, it is going to help employees within the organization to decide about what they are capable of doing and what they are not. And this is related to performance in general. Okay, so when you talk about employees' behavior in terms of its relation to abilities, it is one of the factors which should help employees to decide what to do and what not to do, or if they can do something, up to what extent they are going to be effective and efficient in doing this thing. Okay, through what? Through taking the right decisions, for example, through that those abilities are related to certain tasks or activities. Here we are talking about performance again, and so on. Okay, so this is, we can say, the way that we need to think how to relate those issues that we are going to discuss. This is the first topic we are discussing in organization behavior. In the previous lectures, we have discussed issues which is related to general concepts. Now we start to talk about dynamics. We start to talk about individual dynamics, and then, as I have mentioned earlier, we are going to talk about group dynamics and so on. Okay. The first issue that we are discussing is abilities. So always we need to relate those topics to organizational behavior, or in simple words, to the behavior of employees within the organization. Okay, so abilities is related to behavior. How it is going to affect the performance of employees. It is going to affect the decisions taken by employees, and so on. On the other hand, in addition to intellectual abilities, there is the physical abilities. Okay. When you talk about physical abilities, here we are talking about the capacity to do tasks demanding, for example, stamina, demanding dexterity, strength, in addition to other similar issues. Okay, so here we are talking about abilities where the intellectual activities are not involved. Okay, more we are talking about physical activities. In order to deal with those activities, we need to have physical abilities. Okay, but also we cannot separate totally between intellectual abilities and physical abilities. There are many activities where we need some sort of intellectual abilities and some sort of physical abilities. But those packages are different in nature. But when we talk about applications, in most cases we are going to use intellectual abilities and physical abilities at the same time. Which is more is going to be used, this is depending on the situation itself. In some situations, maybe the physical abilities are going to be demonstrated more than the intellectual abilities or needed more. In other situations, maybe the intellectual abilities are needed more than the physical abilities and so on. Now, in my situation, I'm using intellectual abilities and physical abilities. More I am depending on intellectual abilities than physical abilities. In simple activity, maybe I'm going to depend more on physical activities than intellectual abilities. But in most cases, again, we need to think how we are going to act. Even if we are talking about physical abilities, okay, we need intellectual abilities. So those are related, but it is separated in concept, in nature. But when it comes to the application, usually we need those abilities, or we need to use those abilities together. Okay. Now let us take some examples for physical abilities, okay, or dimensions of physical abilities. Now there are 5 dimensions here, which are categorized in 3 different categories. The first one, strength factors, flexibility factors, and other factors. Okay. Now when you talk about the strength factors, we are talking here about abilities which is related to muscular abilities. Okay. Like, for example, dynamic strength. When you talk about dynamic strength, we are talking about using muscles. Okay? Like lifting something, carrying something, moving something, for example. All those need dynamic strength. When you talk about trunk strength, here we are talking about the ability to use the abdominal muscles. Abdominal muscles, we are talking about those muscles. Okay? Now, those are needed in performing some physical activities, depending about the job and tasks required and so on. Okay. Static strength, here we are talking about up to what extent we can deal with external forces. Okay. Now, when you talk about explosive strength, here we are talking up to what extent individuals can deal with a certain situation. We say explosive because it is something serious, something important, etc. Okay, we do not mean here dynamite and so on. Okay, it is only an expression. Okay. Now, when you talk about flexibility factors, here we are talking about another package of physical activities. This one, it is not related directly to the same above. Okay. For example, yes, exactly. Like extent flexibility and dynamic flexibility. When you talk about extent flexibility and dynamic flexibility, here we are talking about flexibility, it expresses itself, okay? But when you talk about extent flexibility, here we are talking, for example, about up to what, for example, we said trunk strength is the ability to use the abdominal muscles, okay? Now, when you talk about extent flexibility, for example, people bending like this, moving their abdominal muscles, we can talk about angles here. Up to what extent there is flexibility? Some people, they can touch their foot and maybe they are doing here 340 angles, for example. Some people only maybe 60 or 70 and so on. Okay. So here we are talking about flexibility related to moving abdominal muscles. Dynamic flexibility, it is related more to moving. Okay, and using different parts of the body Okay, though that body coordination is related to up to what extent we can coordinate with those parts of the body. And of course, balance, stamina, it's related up to what extent we can deal with pressure. I mean here physical pressure. Okay, now again, physical abilities, it is another package of abilities. It is important in order to deal with those tasks where we need where we are going to deal with physical activities, okay? Again, in most cases, we need both packages, but both packages are different in nature, or are different in concept, we can say, okay? But when it comes to application, here we are talking about applying both packages together, okay? Now, let us talk about examples how those abilities can be used. Now let us talk in details, not in general. In general, we said that this is related to take decisions and it is related to performance and so on. Okay, how those abilities, and I am talking here about intellectual abilities and physical abilities. Give me detailed examples now about how can we use those abilities. Yes.
Well, as for intellectual abilities, it's for example, if you fall into a problem or a surprise problem arises, so it needs, past performance and past thinking in order to solve the problem.
Okay. And when you talk about a problem solving, here we are talking about the decision-making problem. And first we need to analyze the problem, understand the situation, do some sort of diagnosis for the situation, okay? We need to develop alternatives in order to deal with the problem. We need to evaluate the alternatives in order to select or choose the best alternative among those alternatives in order to apply a solution for a certain situation. So all this depends on intellectual abilities. Now, sometimes maybe the problem we need to, when we talk about evaluating the problem, maybe we are going to develop some scale and weights and so on. So when you talk about numbering aptitude, it is important here, for example, how to develop weights and scales and so on in order to evaluate problems, for example. Sometimes we need to use logic. Okay, sometimes we need to use abstract thinking, reasoning, etc. So here we are talking about using intellectual abilities. And the same, we must imagine how can we use all those abilities even when we talk about physical abilities. As I have mentioned earlier, physical abilities are not used alone. People think how they are going to move, how they are going to carry something. Because if they did not think, maybe they are going to carry something and hurt their back, for example, and this usually happens with some people, the way they are lifting something or moving something and so on, okay? So, in addition to physical abilities, we need to use intellectual abilities, and while using intellectual abilities, usually we need to use physical abilities, regardless up to what extent we are going to use the other ability, okay? Now, here again, we need always to relate those issues to the behavior of employees within the organization. We are not studying abilities. We are studying the relation between abilities and OB. Okay? And the same when you talk about learning, and the same when you talk about personality, and the same when you talk about a group. All the topics. We must always identify the relation between those topics and organizational behavior. Okay? This is the way how we need to think and deal with those topics. Okay. Now, another topic here is biographical characteristics. What is biographical characteristics? Yes.
The different characteristics that could fit the word, for example, like age, race, religion, etc.
Okay. It is personal characteristics. Okay. And this is not personality traits, which we are going to study later. Okay, here only we are talking about personal characteristics. Some factors, okay, which is differentiating people from each other. Okay. Now, for example, here we are talking about age, gender, race, in addition to other biographical characteristics like tenure, religion, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Okay. Now we are going to discuss those. But while discussing those, we need to relate each one to performance, for example. Okay, productivity, turnover,
job
satisfaction, absenteeism, and so on. Okay, so we need to relate each one to those factors. Okay, we need to know how age is going to affect performance, how age is going to affect productivity, and so on. Okay, so here we are talking about performance in addition to experience. In addition to experience. Okay, now when you talk about age, there are young people, older people, and so on. Okay, how this is expected to affect experience? Yes.
Like for example, the older workers have for sure more experience than the younger.
Why?
Because they do tasks for more time.
And experience is accumulative. Okay, usually by time, by practice, we have more experience. Okay, that's why of course you said something right. Usually, this is not an absolute result. Okay, in most cases, older people have more experience than younger people. Why? Because they have practiced more, they have learned more, and so on. Okay. Now, what is the relation between age and performance? Yes. And they have energy maybe more than older people. But again, usually, always, in most cases, in most times, and so on. Okay, because those points that we are discussing are not standards. We cannot take it as standard. There are some younger people who lack the energy, and maybe some elder people they have the energy. Okay, but in most cases, yes, older people they have more experience. Younger people they have better performance because they have the energy to that, productivity.
The more young people are employed, the more productivity is high. Especially those jobs which require physical.
Maybe, okay, but when you talk about productivity here, we are talking about the output. Okay, and maybe that's why it is more confusing here. Not necessarily that younger people or older people. This depends more on other other factors, like for example, nature of the job, experience that people have, and so on. Okay, but when it comes to performance level in the job, okay, usually younger people they have more energy. They are more enthusiastic to prove themselves. Okay, they need to achieve some sort of self-actualization and so on. Okay, turnover. Yes.
There is a relatively negative relationship between age and turnover. I mean, young people are the ones who tend to withdraw from work because they're looking for better opportunities.
Exactly, and usually older people they are more willing to settle within organizations when they spend a long time. Why? Because the opportunities for them usually are less. Okay, that's why when it comes to turnover rate, younger people have higher turnover rate than older people. Okay, satisfaction. Yes.
I think it's hard to get the young people satisfied easily. So you maybe you have to do like more efforts to satisfy those young people and beyond. But the old people, it's easy, it's easy to satisfy them.
Most studies reveal that people who spend long time in a job, they are more satisfied. Okay, why? Because usually such people they know how to deal with different activities, don't know the details of the job, all the requirements, and so on. Okay, but this is always related to other issues, but in most cases at least. Okay, when it comes to absenteeism, usually it is mixed here because absenteeism depends on a lot of other factors. But again, when it comes to experience, older people usually have more experience. Performance, usually younger people, they have more energy. When it comes to productivity, it depends here. Turnover rate is higher when it comes to younger people, comparing that to older people. Satisfaction, again, it is mixed, though studies reveal that people who spend long time dealing with the same job, they are more satisfied in most cases. At least absenteeism, again, it is mixed. Okay, so again, when we discuss those points or biographical characteristics, we need to relate it to those issues, which is related, of course, to OB. This is the output that we see. Okay, when we have discussed the relation between independent variables and dependent variables, those were some of the most important points that we have discussed. Gender. We are talking about male, female. Yes?
I think it doesn't depend on the experience, doesn't depend on the gender. So regardless of you are male or female, maybe the female, they have experienced lots of things. So it doesn't depend totally on the gender.
Exactly, and in most of those points, at least, when it comes to performance, productivity, and so on, there is no great difference between males and females, okay, in most cases at least, okay, but there are some differences maybe which is related to absenteeism and so on, okay, but again, there are differences related to how both genders achieve their goals, okay, the way they think, the way they behave, and so on, there are differences. But when it comes to the output, a lot of studies, maybe not in this book available, in other books I have been through, okay, when it comes to decision making, there is no differences in the effectiveness between the two genders, okay, but there are differences related to the mechanisms followed by each, okay. When it comes, for example, to communication, when it comes to the output, there is no difference, okay? But when it comes to the mechanism, there are differences, okay? Some researchers say that male are more aggressive, for example. Females, they usually go around things in order to achieve, when it comes to decisions, communications, and so on, okay? So there are differences in how each is trying to achieve the goals, okay, but when it comes to the output, there are no great differences. But there are differences related to absenteeism and so on, related maybe to some requirements to the rule of each, when we talk about male and female, okay. So this age and gender, let us talk about race. Yes?
I don't think it affects any of those factors.
Okay, but maybe it's not going to affect most of the factors, but still, okay, yes.
In our country, we don't have the differences in race or something like that, but it maybe come into the countries which have globalization and things like that. The races affect, and most studies say that the black people don't have the ability that white people have, and this is maybe an IQ or the abilities, the performance. They don't have the ability. They have the technical abilities or the physical abilities more than intellectual one.
Okay. Even if some researchers have concluded such results, but there must be other explanations. Okay, when you talk about race, one of the issues that is related here and we need to take into consideration is culture. Okay, and when you talk about culture, we are going to relate culture to education and to other variables. Okay, this might affect how people might think, what are their abilities, and so on. Okay, but again, there are no great differences, but due to cultural differences, sometimes, when you talk about in some countries, okay, people, they do not appreciate work. Such people, their performance usually is poor. Okay, here we are talking about a value. Okay, the way they value work is low. Okay, in some countries, people have some negative habits. Okay, related to up to what extent they are active or dynamic and so on. Okay, in some other countries, people have negative habits, which is the opposite. Okay, they are not active, not dynamic. They are lazy, and so on. Okay, this is going to affect productivity, for example. It is going to affect absenteeism, and so on. When we talk about race, and maybe the same when you talk about religion. Okay, here we are not talking about whether the race itself. We are talking about the culture. Okay, we are talking about the values which is expressed through this culture. And when you talk about religion, almost it is the same. Okay, there are some positive effects and some negative effects. Okay, yes.
I was thinking that maybe it has something to do with the culture of the organization itself. I mean, some black people, for example, for instance, they do not get the same opportunities as the white people. And of course, this will affect their performance and their experience.
Especially when you talk about the United States of America. And those examples you are going to see in the book and go through in the textbook that we are reading. Okay? Why? Because they are talking about the American society. Now, there are differences. Maybe there are some policies implemented by some organizations which is negative in terms of encouraging some races over other races. Okay, though that they have laws and regulations, but again, here we are talking about culture. Even if the legislations, rules, etc., forbid such things, but maybe it is something which is inside people, how they deal with each other. Okay, again, here the bottom line that it is not related to the race. It is related to maybe to the culture, maybe to the other races, how they are dealing, and so on. Okay, but again, when you talk about the culture, here we are talking about, for example, what values are prevailed through the culture. For example, we are talking about maybe sometimes regulations and laws and so on. We are talking, when you talk about the organization itself, we are talking about how management is perceiving others. And this is also true when we talk about gender, when we talk about race, when we talk about religion, for example. Okay, and a good example for this is sexual orientation. How people, for example, perceive the other gender. Okay, or how people they perceive the other race, for example, and so on. Okay. Now another point to discuss is tenure. When you talk about tenure, here we are talking about number of years in service. Okay. And this is different when we compare it to experience. Experience, it is related to how much we know about the job. But when you talk about tenure, we are talking about how many years we have spent on the job. Okay, and sometimes people they spend so many years, but they do not have the experience. Maybe their performance is poor, and so on. Okay, tenure again, it is one of the issues which is related to other issues. What was the experience and how management do supervision, whether there is a training, for example, opportunities, and so on. Okay. ماشي، كيف اليوم؟